On July 28, 1973, 600,000 people gathered at a racetrack in upstate New York for the largest concert in American history. The Grateful Dead, the Allman Brothers Band, and the band all played. It was bigger than Woodstock by 150,000 people, and most people have never heard of it. The Watkins Glen Summerjam has become rock and roll's greatest disappearing act. No iconic movie, no legendary live album, just a footnote that Deadheads bring up to one-up Woodstock fans. But the real story isn't what happened on Saturday. It's what happened the night before, when the Grateful Dead played what many consider one of their greatest performances ever, during what was supposed to be just a sound check. And it's about what happened after, when the counterculture's biggest moment got deliberately erased, then quietly exploited anyway. The groundwork started 2 years earlier when Grateful Dead tour manager Sam Cutler had an idea. Cutler had been the Rolling Stones tour manager at Altamont, so he understood festival disasters intimately. He wanted to prove the counterculture could scale without the chaos. In an interview years later, Cutler explained his vision. I kept on saying, one of the ways we build the Grateful Dead is, the Grateful Dead have got to play with other people, but it's got to be like collaborative trips, you know what I mean? Not where the Grateful Dead second on the bill or top of the bill. Let's do a collaborative thing like where you play with the Allman Brothers. The perfect partner was the Allman Brothers Band. In the summer of 1972, members of both bands started jamming together at shows in Hartford and the Bronx. When Dickie Betts and Jerry Garcia played guitar together, something clicked. Allman Brothers biographer Alan Paul says Dickie told him, I always had this concept in my head of what I wanted to do, and the first time I heard Garcia, I thought, oh damn, that guy beat me to it. By late 1972, Cutler and the Allman Brothers booking agent Bunky Odom were planning something massive at Watkins Glen International Speedway in upstate New York. They needed a third act to guarantee maximum ticket sales. The promoters initially booked Leon Russell, who was huge at the time. Then Jerry Garcia stopped them. Garcia felt that upstate New York was the band's home territory. They owed the band the respect of asking them first. The promoters figured the band would decline since they weren't really touring in 1973. But when the band heard Jerry Garcia specifically requested them, they said yes. The promoters had to pay Leon Russell not to play, but the lineup was perfect. 3 legendary bands, 1 stage, 12 hours of music, $10 tickets, and then 500,000 people showed up. The festival was announced in early June with a planned capacity of 150,000 people. By Wednesday, July 25th, 3 days before the scheduled concert, 50,000 people had already arrived. By Thursday, the number hit 100,000. Traffic on the New York State Thruway came to a complete standstill. People abandoned their cars on the highway and walked miles through the countryside. Sociologist Rebecca Adams, who was there, remembered in an interview, we walked and had to leave the car behind, and I swear I thought we walked 20 miles, but maybe it was only 8 or 9 miles, but it was a really, really long way. When she finally arrived, there was no ticket taker. I remember we kind of climbed in through a hedge that was on the side of the road, pushing the branches out of the way. Yeah, and then on the other side, there were all these people. And then there we were. By Friday morning, promoter Jim Koplik was in full panic mode. In an interview decades later, he described the moment. The New York State Thruway was so packed that we were told by the state police that we're closing the Thruway and telling people to turn around and go home. Koplik realized they'd never taken tickets at the gate, so they didn't know who was there and who wasn't. He remembered thinking, I'm about to go out of business because the New York State Thruway is being closed. The state police reopened the Thruway 15 minutes later, but the crowd kept growing. By Friday afternoon, Bill Graham, who'd been brought in to handle production logistics, made the call. Open the gates. Make it free. Bunky Odom explained the decision years later. Instead of being pigs, we decided to make sure the event went off right, so we just opened up the gates and said, free concert. Come on in. The temperature hit 95 degrees. Bill Graham had provided pallets of bottled water for the crowd. And in the press area, something strange was happening. A group of teenage radio geeks from Connecticut had set up an illegal pirate radio station. John Ramsey was 18 years old, running a station called WDBS out of Hartford. In an interview years later, he explained, we picked the call letters because they sounded legitimate, but they stood for why bullshit. They'd driven to Watkins Glen in a rented trailer with a 40-watt transmitter, thinking the festival was near the Canadian border, so they could pretend to be a Canadian station. It wasn't near the Canadian border at all, but they set up anyway, right in the press area, next to the only telephone pole. By Friday evening, Bill Graham decided the band should do a public sound check, and John Ramsey's pirate radio station was about to broadcast what would become legendary. The Allman Brothers went first, then the Grateful Dead took the stage around sunset. The Dead played for 90 minutes across 2 sets, but it wasn't their usual song-based show. It was almost entirely improvised jamming, pure instrumental exploration with no lyrics. Lee Ronaldo, who would later co-found Sonic Youth, was 17 years old in the crowd. In an interview decades later, he described it. It kept feeling like it was going to go into this or that song, you know? But they never did. It just stayed as this abstract jam with no singing. And it just felt like you were hearing them do brand new music, which in essence it was. Steve Silberman, who would later co-author Skeleton Key, a dictionary for deadheads, was just 15. Years later, helping edit a Grateful Dead box set, he called it one of the most beautiful pieces of purely improvised composition. There's not really anything like it. The temperature had dropped dramatically from the daytime heat. People huddled together on wooden pallets salvaged from the water supply. Some had planted a pirate flag made from a bedsheet to find their friends in the massive crowd. The Dead had been cracking down on tapers all year. Flyers were circulating that said, "No taping. Cords will be cut." Taper Jim Cooper remembered a big red-headed guy with a red beard going through the crowd confiscating tapes. When the guy reached Cooper's group, his friend Artie went down to their tape box and pulled a switch. Gave him a blank tape. They lowered their microphones and kept recording. Saturday morning arrived. The Grateful Dead played first in the afternoon daylight. It was a solid show. Steve Silberman points out that everyone dismisses the Saturday show because they compare it to the Friday soundcheck, but he insists it was fine. It was actually a good show. Backstage, Donna Jean Godchaux, the Dead's vocalist who was pregnant at the time, wandered into one of the band trailers. Years later, she remembered, Rick Danko was in one of the rooms and he was singing "Let Me Wrap You in My Warm and Tender Love." And it was a song that I had sang the background on when I was 19 years old on a Percy Sledge record. She said, so Rick Danko and I sat in there and sang that song together. And that was one remembrance that I had with Watkins Glen. And he said, you sang on that. How old are you? You know, when did you do this? Because by that time it was pretty old and I was 19 years old, so. Anyway, that was so much fun getting to sing with Rick Danko. John Belushi, performing in National Lampoon's Lemmings in New York at the time, was also backstage. According to friends who were there, Belushi spent time in the Dead's trailer entertaining them, doing bits and shtick. This was years before Saturday Night Live, before Animal House, just a 24-year-old comedian charming his way into rock history. After the Dead finished, storm clouds rolled in. The band took the stage as lightning started striking around the venue. The band members left the stage afraid of electrocution, but organist Garth Hudson stayed. His organ was in the back of the stage, protected from the rain. He played an 8-minute improvised solo called Genetic Method while lightning lit up the sky. And this is where the pirate radio station became essential. John Ramsey remembered Ron Wickersham from Alembic, the Dead sound company, said, you know, we've always wanted to do low-power broadcasts of our concerts. Because the Dead are always very much pro-recording. You want to come on the road with us and do that? Ramsey climbed up onto the stage scaffolding with his 90-pound transmitter and plugged directly into the soundboard. He stayed up there through the rain, freezing in shorts and a t-shirt, because he knew if he left the transmitter, he'd never see it again. The Allman Brothers closed that night. Chuck Leavell, their keyboard player, remembered flying in by helicopter that morning. When the chopper picked us up and we got up in the air and approached the stage and looked down, it was just this incredible ocean of human bodies. I'd never seen anything like it. Around 2 a.m, members of all 3 bands gathered for the Summerjam everyone had been waiting for. It was exhausted and sloppy. Rick Danko from the band was heavily intoxicated. Chuck Leavell remembered whoever was singing, and I think it was Danko. They were well greased and pretty well inebriated. The lyrics were being slurred, and it was a pretty sloppy performance. And the audience started booing. Danko said, oh, you don't like that one, huh? Okay, I got another one, and started the same song again. Robbie Robertson barely played. Jerry Garcia carried Mountain Jam until the first light of dawn broke over upstate New York. And then came the cleanup. Promoter Jim Koplik stood on the stage Sunday morning, looking out at the field. In an interview years later, he described the moment. I remember looking at Shelley and said, we forgot something. And he goes, what did we forget? I said we forgot garbage cans. 600,000 people had nowhere to throw anything. The cleaning company they'd hired for $5,000 took one look at the site and demanded $50,000. Koplik said, the state health department came in later that Monday and said, if you don't clean this place up, we're going to arrest you. But the bigger question was, what would happen to the music? The promoters desperately wanted to make a Woodstock-style documentary because they knew that's how Woodstock became profitable. The Dead refused unless they controlled the cameras. The Allmans refused to let the Dead control the cameras. So there was no movie. Both the Dead and the Allmans also refused to release a live album. This wasn't because of bad performances or technical problems. It was a deliberate choice. A month later, Rolling Stone quoted Sam Cutler saying, "The Grateful Dead are delighted that Watkins Glen is only a fond memory, and that there will be no further commercial exploitation of what was a tasteful musical trip." The counterculture had proven that hundreds of thousands of people could gather peacefully for collaborative music without the chaos of Altamont, and they chose to let it exist only as memory because commodifying it would betray those principles. Decades passed, the legend grew, especially around that Friday night soundcheck. In the mid-90s, when Steve Silberman was helping edit the So Many Roads box set, the first thing he wanted to include was the Watkins Glen soundcheck jam. He said it was not only as good as he remembered, it was better than he was even capable of remembering. That improvisation became the only music from Watkins Glen officially released for decades, the moment that wasn't even supposed to be a performance. And then in 1994, something strange happened. The band released an album called Live at Watkins Glen. 21 years after the festival, finally, official documentation. Except music scholars started noticing problems. The tracks didn't match the set list from that day. The performances sounded suspiciously studio quality. Researchers eventually discovered the album was mostly outtakes from the band's Moondog Matinee studio sessions, with crowd noise overdubbed. The fake album had apparently been created in late 1973 or early 1974. Then shelved for 2 decades. When it was rediscovered in the 90s, nobody remembered it was fake. They stayed true to their principles. The live album that came out was fake. The next year, California Jam drew 250,000 people with a more corporate-friendly lineup featuring Deep Purple, The Eagles, and Emerson, Lake and Palmer. By the time the Dead played Englishtown in 1977, festival sites were boxed in with shipping containers. The era of freewheeling mega festivals was over. But for the people who were there, it wasn't an ending. Lee Ronaldo described it in an interview years later. Watkins Glen was kind of the beginning of wandering through fields and coming upon groups of freaky long-haired people living this crazy life outside of society to some degree. He went on to co-found Sonic Youth, one of the most influential rock bands of the 80s and 90s. Steve Silberman became one of the Grateful Dead's most important archivists and a celebrated science writer. Rebecca Adams became the first sociologist to seriously study Deadhead culture, eventually teaching a college class that followed the Dead on tour in 1989. Dan Hanklin, who was there with his pirate flag made from a bedsheet, remembered the moment years later. He said, "The whole vibe was one of endurance. The crowd was packed. We were packed on our little raft. Everybody was sweaty and greasy and just miserable, and we were digging on the music. That was the one common denominator. And we were pretty much digging on each other." And there was one more discovery. Jay Curley, who'd been camped on wooden pallets near the stage, remembered in an interview, "I had smoked all my weed during that long, long day. And I didn't have anything more when the concert was over and the lights came up. But I looked in the mud behind our warehouse pallets and there was 8 ounces in nice tight Ziploc bags of weed. There was a half a pound sitting there in the mud. He kept 1 bag and passed 7 out to other people. He said, "That's what I smoked on Jerry's birthday a couple days later." For them, Watkins Glen was the moment they learned you could wander through fields and find your people. That the music was real, that the community was possible. Maybe that was always the point.